So I'm just going to very quickly introduce Michael Stewart, who is visiting us from the University of Queensland, and has been working on very I think has just completed a big manuscript on Procopius and masculinity, and this is sort of what's the right word?
Flotsam and jetsam from the main.
Right. This is a divergence that didn't quite end up being masculinity, but after all, it is Mr. Right, so it really is masculinity. Anyway, without further ado, I'll hand over to Michael, and thanks again for your patience.
Thank you so much. I got some of these wedding rings. I was over at the British Museum when I was scouting here a few days ago, and I saw a lot of beautiful Byzantine rings. This isn't one of them, but these are matrimony rings. First, I want to open by thanking Kate and Richard, who's not here now, for inviting me to speak here tonight. It's certainly a great honor for me. Having spent the past 2 weeks away from the fires devastating my homeland in Australia, I thought that it's magnified some larger issues that I thought I might touch on first. I felt that I left climatically the frying pan to enter the fire when I then went to Venice for a conference last week. This is a lodge that my family and I used to go to in the rainforest. This was it last year, and this is it after the fires devastated it. Then last week, Rachel and I were at hand for the record Aqua Alta in Venice. Though it might sound cliche, we all need to be a powerful voice for climate change, or we all risk losing much that's precious to us. So hopefully tonight's talk will do something to offset the amount of carbon I've used coming here on a plane from Australia and then going back. With that said, I'm certainly excited to be here. I would not have missed the opportunity to meet Kate in person since her work has long inspired me. I first read her masterful Virgin and the Bride for a graduate seminar taught by my mentor, Matthew Kiefler. Now I hope Kate doesn't mind me saying about 2 decades ago now. Among the many stimulating ideas I absorbed from Kate's book and another assigned for the seminar, Carolyn Walker Bynum's Holy Feast and Holy Fast, was the important notion that choosing a life of virginity and not getting married might have been an empowering choice for medieval women. Today's paper on martial alliances amongst elites in Theodora's Constantinople is a topic that's fascinated me for a long time. I touched on the subject in my first book, The Soldier's Life, which primarily looked at men's masculinity, but also examined ancient women from the upper crust and the agency they did or did not have when they were getting married. For instance, when reading Sidonius's vivid description from 467 of the ruckus celebrations he witnessed in Rome surrounding the wedding of the Western Emperor Anthemius, his daughter Alicia, with the much older non-Roman Generalissimo Ricimer, I pondered just what she was thinking on that night. And moreover, what happened to her when the relationship between the two former generals broke down? So did the example of the 5th century Byzantine Empress Ariadne in 491 actively choosing the relatively obscure Anastasius as her future marital partner and imperial partner made me wonder just how active a role women, what was the changing role of the empress in the imperial period as they were playing an increasingly equal role with the emperor. Yet, I think I came to appreciate that we should not always depict women as a homogeneous group, since women from the imperial elite or the upper classes faced a whole set of different challenges from women from the middle, or what we would call the middle or the lower classes. Moreover, since we often rely on written sources with an agenda for our views, what we think we know about these individuals might differ greatly from true reality. Frequently in our ancient sources, portraits of individuals functions to serve the writer's authorial purpose, but then are disposed of just as quickly once they have performed their literary duty. This can lead to an inchoate picture of even the most famous ancient men and women. Think of Belisarius, think of Theodora. The gaps in our knowledge are sometimes astonishing. As we will see, we know that the Empress Theodora had a daughter from a previous relationship, but we never ever learned her name. Imagine not knowing the name of Michelle Obama's daughters. This talk, therefore, represents some of my thoughts on these complex topics, and I hope they will lead to a further discussion afterwards concerning what they might tell us about Procopius's authorial purpose and the complex web of marriage alliances that helped to shape the world of Theodora. I begin with a wedding. Sometime in 528, Constantinople's elite gathered in the palace of Antiochus near the Hippodrome for the marriage of a powerful general and a former actress. The palace, which survives partially as ruins today, had been constructed by the 5th century Emperor Theodosius II, powerful court eunuch. It would have made a magnificent sight for such a ceremony between a couple of relatively humble origins that now found themselves thrust into the upper echelons of Byzantine society. The bride, Comito, was the elder sister of the new Empress Theodora, who had come to the throne the previous year. The groom was a rising general in Justinian's revitalized army and likely Goth, Citas. Of course, High Constantinople's society had witnessed a similar wedding just a few years earlier. The famous union between Justinian and Theodora, which had only been possible because in the early 520s, Justin I had repealed Augustan legislation that had forbidden actresses and senators from marrying, as Cooper has suggested. Theodora and Justinian's union may help us appreciate broader societal shifts surrounding marriage practices. Incremental shifts which accelerated in the 5th and 6th centuries and which led to a number of male Byzantine elites marrying down the social ladder in order to avoid the difficulties presented when joining an equally matched kin group. Though our sources are silent, Theodora probably played a key role in arranging the marriage between her sister and Citas. It was only one of many unions where Theodora linked either her family members or those close to the imperial couple to powerful elites within the military or the older noble households. Our sources are also silent about those from the older families of Constantinople thought about the matter, especially these newlyweds. Unquestionably, Theodora's Constantinople was a place where, to borrow Procopius's words, those from the common herd could quickly rise. From the 5th century, non-Romans serving within the military, such as the Alan Goth Argeburi, acquired the wealth, land, and titles, which allowed them to be absorbed quickly into Constantinople's ruling elite. This is my homage to Kate. Here's another quote. Cooper describes the situation well. Across the empire, the emergence of the super-rich made for jostling between old and new money. New money, at least those who were playing the game, had the advantage. Yet this social mobility does not mean that the rapid rise of such individuals elicited no response. To the contrary, we find writers like Procopius playing upon the more established elite's angst regarding individuals like Theodora and Justinian's rapid ascendance. The social elites from the older nobility, who represented a prime audience for the wars and the secret history, were to have become available, would have understood only too well the dishonor of being passed over for titles and positions by men like the Gothic general Citas, and having to accept as an equal a woman like the former actress Comito, whom they considered to be their social inferior. Be that as it may, reflecting the increased militarization of the age, military men like Citas could be found throughout the upper stratum of Byzantine society. Justinian, like many of the new ruling elite, hailed from a military family. Not less than 7 of Justinian's relatives served as generals during and after his rule. His was just one of many such families with a long tradition of military service. Even the offspring of murdered and discredited generals like the Alan Aspar, murdered on the orders of the Emperor Leo I in 472, and Goth Vitilian, murdered at Justinian's behest in 520, continued to prosper in a world that did not seem to hold a grudge against these murdered generals' families for long. As we will see, these men and their sons represented a prime group of individuals that other elites could link their sons and daughters through marriage alliances. We know quite a bit about the groom Sittis, who plays an important role in many of our surviving sources. Sittis enters the historical record when we hear of him serving alongside Belisarius as a bodyguard of Justinian, then Magister Militum per Orientem. 6th century Byzantium was a place with plenty of opportunity for those from the hinterland to earn a living as a hired sword. The Emperor Justin and his adopted nephew and rechristened Justinian had arrived at separate times from the prefecture of Illyricum to the capital seeking work as hired swords and had risen to serve within the elite palace guards. Justinian served as an elite member of the 40-man candidati under the Emperor Anastasius, while Justin was the first known comus of the bodyguard Nosia Executorum, which would become a pipeline for future Byzantine emperors such as Tiberius II. We should not see Justinian's role in the bodyguards as a purely ceremonial position, as many scholars do. These bodyguards served as an emperor's last line of defense, and thus were chosen for their physical qualities and military prowess. Some modern historians underplay Justinian's rather long military career. Yet, as Brian Croke has suggested, it is likely that Justinian had participated in Anastasius's military campaigns in the east, and that it was his military reputation that he had earned during his time there which had led to his selection into this elite bodyguard unit. Some, though I'm not one of them, have even suggested that it was while campaigning in the east that Justinian had first met Theodora. Whatever the truth of these matters, throughout his long reign, Justinian managed to maintain a good relationship with most of the important segments of the army, remarkable considering the strain he frequently placed upon these units. Justinian's time in the palace guards appears to have helped him to understand both the rivalry within these elite units and the dangers they could present to an emperor who lost his hold over them. Therefore, it comes as little surprise that Justinian granted his trusted bodyguards, Sittis and Belisarius, prime commands and sought to bind them closer to him through marriage. Though Sittis is not well known today, at the time of his wedding, he was just as important a general as Belisarius. In 527, Justinian had appointed Sittis and Belisarius as co-commanders of an invasion of Persia-Armenia. It was at this time that Sittis would have likely met Procopius, who had been appointed personal advisor to Belisarius in that same year. In 528, Sittis was appointed in the new office of Magister Militum per Armenium. Following the defeat of Belisarius in a battle against the Persians in 531, Sittis replaced him in the leadership of the forces in the east. Sittis received the title as patrician in 539 and was named honorary consul in 536. In 538, Sittis was sent to Armenia to put down a local revolt against heavy taxation, where he was subsequently killed by a Persian-Armenian, Artabanus, who was fighting then for the Persians. Artabanus is a man we will hear much more about a bit later in this lecture. As with the case with most ancient women, we know much less about Comito. Comito, as we can see from the quotation above, as the elder sister of Theodora, had earned Procopius' scorn in secret history. Indeed, he argues that she passed down her scandalous arts to her younger sister. However, interestingly, she is not mentioned anywhere else in his writings, which, given the story to come, I find strange. Indeed, it is what Procopius does not tell us about Sittis and Comito that first spurred my interest when I realized that it is only by reading Malalas that we learn of the marriage between the pair. Procopius, who heaps praise upon Sittis in the wars, and was surely acquainted with the general, for whatever reason, never mentions the marriage. We might linger a second to ponder why this might be and stash these ideas away for our subsequent discussions. The union would prove important to Justinian's succession in 565. Most modern scholars believe that Citis and Camito were the parents of the future Empress Sophie, born around 530, who would go on to become one of the most powerful Byzantine empresses, and perhaps one of my favorite people from late antiquity. I actually have this coin that I carry around with me, and perhaps not coincidentally, one of my daughters is named Sophia. Some might argue, of course, that Procopius, who in all likelihood had died long before Justinian, could not have known the regal destiny of Citis and Comito's daughter, and therefore did not feel it necessary to conclude her in the wars, since women, even powerful ones, were peripheral to his main topic of men in battle. Yet, as we will discuss further below, the centrality of Citis to key events in the wars would have provided Procopius with an ideal opportunity to discuss the general's links to the imperial family. This is yet another reminder about how our deep gaps of knowledge can be about even such basic facts, and the danger of relying upon Procopius for a vision of individuals and events. As recent scholarship on key individuals from the wars, like Amalasuntha, Theodora, and in my new book about Totila, has shown, Procopius often offers an illusion of more knowledge about individuals or events than he really has. Especially, we should be careful about relying on the secret history for these truths, as Henning Born has warned in his recent amazing article. Another key point that I would stress is that what Procopius leaves out is just as important to appreciate as what he includes. So does context and sequence matter, and especially since Book 8 of the Wars was composed in the aftermath of a dramatic turnaround in the East Romans' military fortunes in the 2 years after the first 7 books of the wars were published in either late 550 or 551, and the secret history was likely abandoned in the summer of 550. This means that his depictions of individuals like the Gothic king found in Book 7, Gothic king Totila found in Book 7 and Book 8 should not be conflated. They must be interpreted in the light of the different circumstances surrounding their composition. In Book 7, Procopius needed to explain why Totila and the Goths had been able to recover much of Italy from the East Romans, and at the very least, at this time, Totila, by around 550, was in position to dictate terms to Justinian. Therefore, Procopius in Book 7 creates a vision of a morally corrupt Roman high command being beaten both by fortune and a Gothic general who displayed many of the masculine traits of an idealized Roman general found in much in the ancient literature. However, by the time Book 8 was published in 554, Totila was dead and the East Romans on the brink of a total victory. This turnaround needed to be explained by Procopius. So in Book 8, Totila becomes much more of a typical barbarian leader, displaying military qualities, but succumbing to aspects of his unstable barbarian side. And like his Goths, he ultimately succumbs to the supremacy of Roman arms. This vital need to appreciate the gestation of Procopius' writing and to unlock the larger context and arrangement is particularly important for our purposes tonight, since examples of the marital alliances that we will discuss below were being composed during the nadir of Byzantine fortunes around 550. Unquestionably, by the mid-540s, Justinian's reconquest was in deep trouble. Gone were the heady days of 534 and 540, when Belisarius had hauled the Vandal and Gothic kings back to Constantinople in chains. Justinian's attempts to recover the lost territories of the Western Empire had instead devolved into a quagmire of seemingly endless military operations on military fronts. Procopius offers in both his wars and infamous secret history dramatic accounts of the desperate military situation in Italy in the late 540s. These parallels are not accidental, since as we have seen, both accounts were likely being written at around the same time. One must keep this gloomy context constantly in mind when reading both the secret history and the close of Book 7 of the Wars, where Procopius claims that Belisarius had become so desperate for funding and reinforcements that in 548 he had sent his wife Antonina back to Constantinople to ask her old friend Theodora for funds and troops. Here Procopius hints that Antonina had been tasked with this mission because Belisarius could not trust fellow members of his East Roman High Command. In fact, slightly earlier in this book, Procopius describes how a similar mission in 545, led by the young general John, had come to naught because rather than going and raising money, John had arranged a marriage with himself with the daughter of Germanus, who had, I think it was Justinus. He has Justin, Justinian, and Justina. So he was really sucking up to Justin when he named his kids. Yet ultimately, Antonina also failed in her mission. The meeting between Antonina and Theodora never happens. In June of 548, the empress had died of cancer, shortly sometime before Antonina arrives. Faced with a deteriorating situation in Italy, and with another Persian invasion looming, and with Antonina asking him, Justinian then recalls Belisarius back to Constantinople. It is against this backdrop in the wars that Procopius transitions back in time to relate the circumstances surrounding a bungled plot to assassinate Justinian. The secret history also reports Antonina's failed mission and the humiliation of Belisarius' recall from Italy. As it commonly does, however, the secret history provides some further scandalous details missing from the more sober wars. In this instance, it offers another motive for Antonina's departure from Italy. Twisting temporal reality to his literary advantage, Procopius relates that before her death, Theodora had sought to betroth her grandson Anastasius, the son of her unnamed daughter, to Belisarius and Antonina's only daughter, Joannina, the sole heir to their vast fortune. Outwardly, the fact that Theodora sought to link her grandson to a couple, Belisarius and Antonina, with whom she seemingly had a strong and important bond, makes some sense. As we've discussed, the imperial family had a long track record of making just such arrangements with those close to them. Yet, as Procopius explains, Antonina and Belisarius both opposed the marriage. According to Procopius, Theodora had not wanted to wait for their approval, capitalizing upon the fact that they were both stuck in Italy. Some months earlier, according to Procopius, Theodora had coaxed Anastasius to seduce Joannina. The historian indeed claims that Anastasius had forced himself upon the young woman, thus making a marriage necessary. When Theodora died, however, Antonina supposedly had separated the newlyweds, which according to Procopius elicits a negative response for Constantinople's upper crust, since supposedly the couple had fallen in love, and if her husband had abandoned her now, she would be considered as tarnished goods by other prospective suitors. Unfortunately, like many episodes in Procopius and from Secret History, we learn nothing further from Procopius nor any other further sources about the matter, though most modern historians speculate, including Evans in his recent book, that eventually Antonina and Belisarius had accepted the marriage. So it's one of these cases where once again, a woman serves the purpose in his history, but disappears, and we don't learn anything more about her. If we accept the basic truths of Procopius' account, we might ask, why were Belisarius and Antonina so opposed to the marriage? As Alan Cameron argued some years ago, Antonina and Belisarius' hesitance to bind themselves further to the imperial family likely did not derive, as Procopius claimed, from a fear that Theodora and Justinian had an eye on their fortune, but more likely stemmed from issues of status. This is the slide of the stemma, that magnificent stemma. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation in it, but from Alan Cameron's House of Anastasius article, a lot of these are imaginary, but it's an interesting that we can think about it, and that the fact that we actually have to make up some of these connections But we'll continue to have a look at this, but this shows you just some of the connections between families. It's indeed probable that Theodora's daughter was not Justinian's, and importantly, never adopted by Justinian and thus illegitimate. As Cameron concluded, Antonina naturally wanted a real aristocrat or a real prince for a son-in-law. Procopius, at the close of Book 7 of Wars, traces the origins of a plot to assassinate Justinian to another thwarted marriage. In this instance, it's a proposed unions between Pryecta and the daughter of Justinian's sister and the up-and-coming Persian-Armenian general Artabanus, who we had heard earlier, had killed Citas in battle. Sometime, we're not sure, but in the early 540s, Citas switches sides to the Roman side. Procopius, and this is what I was looking at in my book on gender, wields gendered and sexual language that echoes very closely the vocabulary found in the secret history in this final part of Book 7 of the Wars. According to Procopius, Artaban's determination to marry Pryecta stemmed from a combination of political ambition and an immoderate desire for Justinian's niece. That Procopius expected his audience to appreciate the negative connotations of Artaban's desire is supported by an example from Secret History 9.30, where Procopius draws on a similar theme when describing Justinian's overpowering love for Theodora. In contrast to Artaban's overzealous passions, in Procopius' telling, Justinian's niece pursues the marriage for more practical and certainly more rational reasons. She did not love Artabanus, according to Procopius, but acknowledged a heavy debt of gratitude to him for protecting her from the rebel Gontharis, who had slain her former husband, the general Arabinus, who Procopius interestingly describes as an elite from the aristocracy of Rome, but who we think was probably linked to the Alan Aspars family. This is just another example of how quickly people that are considered non-Romans in a few generations could be moved into the higher echelon of East Roman culture. Pryecta's modesty may be contrasted with Procopius's vision of Antonina's and Theodora's immodesty in the Secret History, in comparison to the ideal woman who were demure, loyal, pious, merciful, and chaste. Theodora and Antonina famously were, in Procopius's view, immoral prostitutes eager to take on unnatural masculine roles. As Peter Brown once noted, Procopius seeks to undermine these social climbers' claims to be virtuous and noble Roman women. In sharp contrast, by publicly submitting to Artaban's masculine authority and accepting her role in public as a reward in a contest of war, Pryecta conversely displayed the characteristics of an idealized Byzantine woman. And we discussed, when we were thinking about the 5th century, all sorts of examples of women being used when Aetius fights Bonifacius, the wives of the defeated general, Aetius marries her. We have all sorts of examples of this going on. As I see it, this depiction offers Procopius' contemporary audience a way to ponder the nature of Artabanus, displaying subtle differences between current and late antique gender values. Procopius' portrait of a love-struck Artabanus was not meant to be flattering as it might be by present standards. As is well known, Greek and Roman writers used a lack of sexual self-control to discredit their opponents. Classical Roman ideals of masculinity dictated that the effeminate was one who gave in to carnal desire. Despite his character flaws, Artabanus reaps the rewards for his loyalty to the emperor. Justinian named him as Arabinus' replacement as Magister Militum per Africam. His rapid ascendancy from rebel to commander in North Africa, however, does not satisfy Artabanus. Believing that a marriage to Pryecta would bring him closer to the throne, Artabanus, to borrow Procopius' words, continued to invent various false pretexts to induce the emperor to recall him to Constantinople so that the wedding could proceed. These are not the actions of a conventional hero. Rather than portray Artabanus as a classic villain, however, Procopius explains that Artaban's meteoric rise from rebel to mighty general played a role in his improper conduct, declaring, "For when men lay hold upon prosperity unexpectedly, their minds remain unstable, but in their hopes they ever keep going forward until they are deprived even of the good luck that had been undeservedly theirs." Procopius then declares that while Artaban's great deeds had played a role in his rise, so had good fortune. I would suggest by highlighting innate character flaws and accentuating the role of chance in his rise, Procopius prepares the reader for Artaban's coming disgrace. Fortune, for the time being, continued to shine upon Artaban's, in a sign of how readily East Romans assimilated those from the fringes and outside of the empire, especially warriors. Procopius relates Artaban's hero's welcome upon his arrival to the capital of Constantinople. Outwardly, at least, Artaban's displays many of the qualities of true masculine virtue. The populace respects Artaban's as a tried and loyal warrior, a man of few words, a bit like Clint Eastwood. He was tall, handsome, and a fine fighter, the epitome of the manly warrior in 6th century Byzantium. Importantly, for the war's status-obsessed Byzantine readership, the general's deeds in North Africa and loyalty had seen Artaban's ascending even further up the ladder of imperial-sponsored offices. Artaban's was truly a man on the rise. Who better to marry Justinian's niece? We can also see in this comparison of Artaban's and his arrival into Constantinople a comparison with Belisarius' arrival at the opening of the book. So this is at the close of Book 7, we have the arrival of Artaban's. At the opening of Book 7, we have Belisarius' triumphal arrival into Constantinople, and then Procopius talks in very masculine and gendered language about how the locals in Constantinople used to watch as Belisarius and his Vandals and Gothic bodyguard would leave and march manfully through the city. So I do think that there are some parallels here from this opening scene in Book 7 with this closing being seen in Book 7. So we said the prospective marriage made sense for both sides. The emperor was surely aware of the importance of thwarting further uprisings amongst the Armenians, which had left Justinian's eastern borders vulnerable to Persian attacks throughout the previous 2 decades. The binding of his family to a powerful Armenian warlord would have strengthened Justinian's alliance with Artaban's and his cadre of tough fighters. It instantly would have elevated Artaban's to a higher social level and a cultural level matched probably by no other Roman general, including Belisarius. Artaban's, to the blue-blooded niece of Justinian, would have made their offspring contenders for the purple, particularly since Justinian stubbornly refused to name an heir, a reluctance that would continue right up until his death in 565. Of course, we find proof of the validity of Artaban's dreams in the parentage of the Empress Sophia. However, as occurs frequently in the wars, when something was too good to be true, it usually was. Artaban's former life in Persia, Armenia, helps to unravel his plans for a new one in Constantinople. Gender bias sneaks into Procopius' analysis, as it's prone to do. Similar to how Belisarius' obsession with his wife Antonida impacted his military affairs in the secret history, Artaban's schemes were undone by his wife, described by Procopius as a relation of his who had married Artaban's when he was a young man, only after years apart to suddenly appear in Constantinople to thwart the new marriage by revealing that she remained legally married to Artaban's. In this instance, Procopius clearly commiserated with Artaban's plight, seeing the woman, pardon to use the modern term, as a gold digger who had only showed up in Constantinople because Artaban's newfound fame and fortune. Relying heavily upon Artaban's side of the story, Procopius contends that Artaban's had repudiated her long ago, glibly commenting, doubtless because of one of those causes that had developed such as lead to the estrangement of man and wife. Treadgold has used statements like these to suggest that perhaps Procopius was unhappily married, but that's probably going a little bit too far in taking a biographical approach. Rejected by Artabanus, the spurned woman takes her case to Theodora, who makes one of her infrequent appearances in the wars. Certainly the focalization on Theodora's should raise our suspicions that Theodora's meddling in men and women's marital affairs serves as a key line of attack employed against her in the secret history. It is conceivable that this, like other episodes of the wars concerning the empress, may have originated from the secret history and were only integrated into the wars after her death, as has been argued. Even if, as I suppose, this episode is not a later insertion, it seems that Procopius sought to appeal to an audience in Constantinople who, if not calling for Justinian's assassination, may have hoped the emperor would shift political course in the wake of Theodora's death, a more conciliatory path he does indeed take. However, a notorious critic of women who had played an active part in political affairs, Procopius hardly hid his scorn when describing the empress' role in blocking the union. He wrote, "Falling upon the mercy of the empress, she, Artaban's wife, requested that her husband take her back. The empress then, for it was her nature to side with women in distress, decided that Artaban's had to dwell with her, whether he liked it or not. Instead, Pryecta would marry the blue-blooded John, the grandson of Hypatius, the nephew of the former emperor Anastasius." You can see that in the former slide. Outwardly, Theodora had actually made a reasonable choice, since, as we can see in our slide, John's connection within Constantinople were certainly prestigious. Mirroring his approach in other parts of the wars, Procopius indeed hesitates to censure the empress too severely, since one could read his statement concerning Theodora's tendency to assist unfortunate women on multiple levels. Instead, he concentrated on what he expected his readers to see as gendered norms. Like some other East Romans of his day, Procopius deemed that a husband's control of his wife and their children was a manifestation of his masculinity. Therefore, for a woman, even an empress, to dictate whom Artaban should marry broke the acceptable patterns of sexual hierarchy, and I would suggest in the historian's mind emasculated the general. Due to legislation that protected wives from their increasingly powerful husbands, Theodora was certainly within her rights to prevent a wife from being unlawfully cast off. Moreover, Procopius had reason to describe this encounter with care. Even though tradition had granted historians leeway to speak uncomfortable truths, Procopius had to be careful not to push things too far in the wars. Procopius might argue here that Theodora was simply adhering to an even more important aspect of imperial philanthropia, whereby the imperial family, especially the empress, cared for strangers and the oppressed. In fact, in his other major work, Buildings, Procopius promotes this paradigm positively by presenting Theodora's charitable deeds towards downtrodden women more constructively. Theodora's altruistic deeds towards the disenfranchised represents a central feature in the ample Byzantine sources friendly or more neutral to the empress. Yet unfortunately, most people still continue to rely on Procopius and the problematic secret history for a lot of their beliefs about Theodora. But stay tuned to the book. I have a big book chapter on secret history. We also may read Theodora's decision to marry Pryecta to the esteemed offspring of the house of Anastasius, either positively or negatively. We might conclude that Theodora had ulterior motives, since even the casual reader can detect that the historian sought to show that Theodora cared less here about protecting the rights of a spurned wife than about her family's continuing rise up the Byzantine social ladder. Nevertheless, some within the early Byzantine audience would have appreciated Theodora looking out for the best interests of her family. By protecting the welfare of her side of the family, Theodora simply followed accepted practices for Roman wives. And by protecting Justinian's side of the family, she also promoted those. These alternate views built into the just gender system concerning wives' appropriate power helps to explain why each time Procopius condemns Theodora's meddling, he had to argue that the empress had become involved for sinister reasons. Moreover, it seems significant that Procopius does not link Theodora's reluctance to give the marriage the green light to the fact that Artabanus had killed her brother-in-law Sidus, albeit fairly in battle. This is the case, one of these things happens in Procopius. We rarely think that that would be mentioned, that would be great. Even in secret history, it would be really great that she was against the marriage of Artabanus because he had been killed in battle. He's even a bit skeptical of Artabanus' story of how it had happened, kind of showing it maybe that he was bragging and giving another case where Sidus had died at the hands of someone else. So we're skeptical a little bit, Procopius is being skeptical a little bit about Artabanus. Procopius explains that once Theodora died, Artabanus immediately expelled his wife. Nevertheless, thwarted in his plans to marry the emperor's niece, he supposedly bore a simmering grudge against Justinian, which then allows another disgruntled Persian Armenian, Arsaces, to bully him with a barrage of gendered insults into entering the plot to assassinate Justinian. And if you haven't read it, I suggest that you read how Arsaces bullies Artabanus into joining the plot. The language that he uses is very similar to that of which Antonina uses to bully Belisarius in secret history. This bullying, as I said, of Artabanus echoes closely the bullying of Belisarius, which leads to personal and military disasters. Moreover, the fact that Artabanus, and as we recall, Antonina only felt comfortable to act after Theodora's death shows that it was the empress they feared. It certainly fits the pattern of Procopius' depiction of the imperial couple found in the secret history, where Theodora is someone who refused to be swayed by others and was a formidable enemy. In contrast, Justinian was relatively easygoing and readily influenced by others. In fact, when the plot is hatching, part of the reason that Procopius gives, the reason why Arsaces is able to instigate the plot, is because when Arsaces betrays the Romans to the Persians, Justinian does not punish him and is fairly lenient to them. It's one of the several examples in the wars where Justinian is actually is criticized for not being harsh enough on his enemies. And the consequences of not punishing him leads to a plot that almost sees him killed. By thwarting the ambitions of Artabanus, Justinian sows the seed for a future conspiracy, or at least this is how Procopius presents it. Indeed, Justinian's powerful cousin Germanus and his son Justin are tempted to enter the plot, partly because Procopius claims that Theodora had openly sought to block Germanus' son's marriages. A move which Juan Cygnus Condonor has suggested may stem from Germanus' family ties to powerful aristocrats within Italy. If this link is true, what Jordanes talks about, it may be possible that Theodora is really worried that Germanus and his sons are going to overtake her side of the family in the succession. While I do not have time here to discuss Procopius' detailed and somewhat fishy recreation of the circumstances behind the bungled plot, Germanus and his sons emerge largely politically unscathed. Weakened politically by his failures in the West and frightened by his cousin's moves against him, the pragmatic Justinian moved closer to Germanus by placing in command of a revitalized army of reconquest, gathering to crush the Goths once and for all. And he allowed him to marry the now 30-year-old granddaughter of Theodoric and former wife of the Gothic king Vidigus, who had died in 542, maybe a victim of plague, but once again, we don't know. They marry. To them, this is symbolic because this couple would have provided the disparate factions in Italy a symbolic marital coupling by which to rally behind. But to Procopius' seemingly heartfelt regret, expressed in both the wars and the secret history, this union never occurred. Germanus dies in mid-550 before the military campaigns launched. which is not, I think, coincidentally, as others have argued, around the same time that it seems that Procopius abandons the secret history and sets it aside. We learn from sources other than Procopius that Matasuntha had refused to marry after his death and had given birth to a son named Germanus, who can possibly be identified with a Germanus and leading senator in the reign of the Emperor Maurice, whose daughter married Maurice's eldest son, Theodosius, who I've just learned in a recent article, someone is arguing may have survived the executions by Phocas and may have survived a time in the Persian camp. I'm not sure. To conclude, the rapid rise and fall of these families helps us to understand why marital alliances play an important part in Procopius' thoughts on causation. To conclude, the degree to which Procopius' accounts of these marriage alliances may be regarded as accurate reflections of contemporary realities rather than literary devices is something that we can discuss further. Nevertheless, I believe that they can tell us something about Procopius' authorial intents as well as the preoccupations of his intended audience. As we have seen in this short discussion, with his rather narrowly aimed barbs, Procopius in both the wars and the secret history deftly played upon the anxiety of noble parents from Constantinople's upper crusts, individuals whose prestige and long-term relevance could depend upon finding a Mr. or a Mrs. Right for their offspring from a select pool of candidates who could always expect to be highly scrutinized by their peers. Thank you.